Good afternoon. I'm Howard Milstein, Cornell class of 73, Arts and Sciences. Today we've gathered to hear from President Bill Clinton on the state of our democracy. But first, some background. After a long session of the Constitutional Convention, Benjamin Franklin was asked, "What kind of a government have you given us?" His reply, "A democracy, if you can keep it." Our democratic republic can only survive as long as we, the people, value it and keep it alive. Today, more than 200 years after Ben Franklin's admonition, our democracy seems to be at a crossroads. A recent Pew survey revealed that nearly 2/3 of Americans are dissatisfied with our democracy, and more than half don't think our nation is governed for the benefit of all the people. Thomas Jefferson, while a man of contradictions to be sure, was the most democratic of our founding fathers. He advanced the concept of democracy that was made up of four broad themes: social equality, economic equality, freedom, and republicanism. The Pew survey mentioned earlier echoes those themes. The survey found that dissatisfaction is closely linked to feelings about the economy. In that regard, too many of us now feel the American dream is out of reach. And although the vast majority of us believe that voting gives us a say, our experience over the last several decades shows that politicians rarely seem to care about average citizens. Pew further tells us that satisfaction with our democracy is linked to confidence in its institutions and values, a fair judiciary, regularly held honest elections, free speech with an independent media and unfettered use of the internet, gender equality, and freedom of religion. But those bedrock values seem to be eroding. Large swaths of Americans have lost confidence in our elections. Cancel culture is inhibiting speech. Trust in the media has plummeted. Full gender and racial equality have yet to be achieved. And although religion has become a kind of litmus test for holding public office, religious minorities often feel targeted for their beliefs. With today's program, we launched the Milstein Democracy Forum with our first State of Our Democracy address, featuring President Bill Clinton. Our democracy needs to be revived, reshaped, and revalued. That's why the Democracy Forum is so important. This forum brings together high-level policymakers, elected officials, and marketing experts with the goal of developing ideas, messages, and legislation that will restore faith in our democracy and heal our fractured nation. To that end, we will be holding a series of dinners with members of Congress to explore the best way forward. One promising idea that would bring us together across racial, religious, ethnic, and political lines is universal national service. I believe that Steve Israel and the Cornell Institute for Politics and Global Affairs are up to the challenge. With the help of Bill Clinton and others, we can come up with solutions that will help us restore one nation with liberty and justice for all. Now I'd like to turn the program over to my friend, Bob Harrison, Chairman of Cornell's Board of Trustees. Bob.
Thank you, Howard, and thank you for all you and your family have done for Cornell for so many years. When Congressman Israel asked me to introduce President Clinton, I was absolutely thrilled because his participation in a Cornell event is deeply meaningful to me personally. Between serving on the Cornell Board of Trustees for nearly 20 years and serving as CEO of the Clinton Global Initiative for nearly a decade, this brings together the two institutions that have shaped my life and mattered to me more than any others. I'll never forget the first time President Clinton attended a Cornell event. It was in 2004, when he was the senior class convocation speaker during commencement weekend. It was held on Sholkoff Field on the Ithaca campus, and the stadium was packed to capacity despite the crazy fact that the temperature was in the high 40s on a very windy Saturday of Memorial Day weekend. Everyone wore the wrong clothes. No one expected that weather in late May in Ithaca, but no one complained, and the president not only brought the house down with his remarks, but he stayed around shaking hands with hundreds of students, parents, and alumni long after the event was over. That is who President Clinton is. He connects with people in a way that no one else I've ever met does. For those of you who were not yet born in the 1990s, and that includes a lot of the students on this call. I'll point out that President Clinton is not just the co-author of a recent best-selling mystery novel, The President is Missing, and the host of a wildly popular new podcast called Why Am I Telling You This? But he's also the 42nd President of the United States, serving 2 terms during which the country experienced the longest period of economic prosperity in our history, including the creation of 22 million jobs. For the last 20 years, President Clinton has been as active in his post-presidential period as he was while he was in office, largely through the Clinton Foundation and the Clinton Global Initiative. When I left my Wall Street career to focus on public service activities, I had the privilege of serving as CEO of the Clinton Global Initiative, or CGI. It was the most fulfilling professional experience of my life. President Clinton created CGI in 2005 to address the biggest challenges the world faced: access to healthcare, access to education, poverty alleviation, and climate change. He did this by creating a new model that had never before existed. He convened all the critical actors who could make a big difference: companies, governments, philanthropists, and NGOs, as only he could. And he asked them to make a commitment, beyond just talking about it, to take specific, measurable actions to move the needle on at least one of these pressing global challenges. For the next decade, CGI participants from the public sector, the private sector, and civil society forged partnerships and made more than 3,600 commitments, which have been implemented in over 180 countries and have positively impacted over 435 million people. No one but President Clinton could have motivated so many to do so much. I have heard him speak at hundreds of events over the years since his first Cornell appearance in 2004. My favorite Bill Clinton line is "Get caught trying." It's the best advice I've ever been given. As chairman of the Cornell board and a member of the Clinton Foundation board, it is my honor and privilege to welcome back to Cornell the 42nd President of the United States, the founding chairman of the Clinton Foundation, and my former boss, President Bill Clinton. Before turning the program over to Congressman Israel, director of the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs here at Cornell, let me direct your attention to this very brief video about the Institute's campaign for the future of democracy. Thank you, and enjoy the discussion.
After all that's happened,
the deadly siege on Congress as an angry pro-Trump mob storms the U.S. Capitol.
This is one of those pivotal moments when every one of us, as citizens of the United States, need to determine just who it is that we are, just what it is that we stand for.
The daily work of democracy itself is the path of progress. It teaches cooperation, the free exchange of ideas, peaceful resolution of differences.
There is nothing wrong with America that cannot be cured by what is right with America.
This is precisely our mission today, to preserve freedom as well as peace. We must take actions to assist the campaign for democracy.
together we can protect democracy in America. Join the campaign for the future of democracy. Go to the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell University to learn more.
Hi, everybody. This is former Congressman Steve Israel. Thank you so much for participating with us this evening. Thank you, Bob Harrison. Thank you, Howard Milstein. Thanks to the Howard and Abby Milstein Foundation for their support, and the Larry and Judy Tannenbaum Distinguished Speakers Fellowship of Sigma Phi. And Mr. President, thank you so much for joining us. This is just an extraordinary opportunity. And we're so proud and privileged to host you this evening. Now, I know that everybody wants to get right into the Q&A, Mr. President, but I also need you to know and want everybody to know how many members of Congress and former members of Congress are participating in this, are watching and listening, and on a bipartisan basis. So, Mr. President, you should know that we're joined by Congressman Brendan Boyle from Pennsylvania, and Jerry Conley from Virginia, and Josh Gottheimer from New Jersey, Peter Welch from Vermont, so many former members that you worked with, John Barrow, Charlie Dent, Bill Enyart, Elizabeth Esty, Rush Holt, Elizabeth Holtzman, Martin Frost, Jim Colby, Max Rose, Susan Molinari, Mike McMahon, now the District Attorney of Richmond County, Joe Sestak, Chris Shays, Zach Wamp, also New York State Assemblyman Chuck Levine, Richard Trumka, the president of the AFL-CIO, is with us this evening, and Dick Ravitch, the chairman of the Institute. That is to your credit, Mr. President, that so many members of Congress on a bipartisan basis would join this afternoon. Mr. President, let's get right into some questions. The video that we just saw shows you and three of your fellow presidents speaking passionately and on a bipartisan basis about the values of democracy, but things seem different now. So let's start with your view of democratic norms at home and abroad, from Ronald Reagan's presidency to Joe Biden's. President Clinton, what is happening to democracy?
Well, first of all, I want to thank Howard and Bob and you. I think you were a terrific member of Congress. As you know, I also like your books. I've gotten a lot of laughs and learned a lot from them. But I think that we are at a fairly perilous point in our democratic journey. And we have periodically these kinds of challenges, but I think that it's worth noting that, and I should make full disclosure here, I supported Joe Biden for president. Hillary did. We thought he was probably the only person who could win. Secondly, I think it's worth noting what happened in the election. While he did win by more than 7 million votes, we had 153 million votes cast. So there was a massive turnout of the Republican base as well as the Democratic base. And actually the highest voting Americans were evangelical Christians and extreme white nationalists. 87% of them voted. So even though Joe won by 7 million votes, 44,000 votes the other way, and the Electoral College would have been tied. That's the sum total of the Biden victories in Wisconsin, Georgia, and Arizona. So if that had happened, then the election would have gone to the House of Representatives, where each state, Wyoming and California, both get one vote. And Donald Trump would still be president of the United States. So what's happened to the democratic norms partly is that nobody knows what they are or care anymore, because we've been playing around the edges of them for quite a long time. And as a result, if you look at our founders, they set up a system that was designed to do two mutually incompatible things. They were designed to stop the abuse of power, because many people came to the United States as a result of wanting to get away from monarchical government, authoritarian government. And they designed a remarkable republic. But at the heart of it was the compromise with slavery, which is intrinsically an abuse of power. And they tried to balance the interest of large and small states, which led, among other things, to the Electoral College, which is now an instrument of abuse of power by a minority. That is, if you spot one party 36 to 40 electoral votes on the front end, and it's only going to get worse, then you have a whole different set of challenges before you. We've been through an interesting period since the crash in 2008, and even before. We've seen increasing income inequality, and more importantly, market economic stagnation. I haven't seen the Biden numbers yet, but if you go back to 2016, Donald Trump won 4 more counties than Hillary did in the election. But the counties she won accounted for 66% of the GDP of the country. His 34%. Ironically, the median income of a Trump voter was $1,000 higher. It's not poverty so much that drives people nuts, it's the absence of a way out. And stagnation is deadening to a democracy. People look in the mirror every day and they think every tomorrow is going to be just like yesterday. They're ripe for the politics of resentment. Then you had an unprecedented amount of social change, almost all of which I supported, but it was hard for people to absorb against the background of a sense of economic stagnation, social disempowerment, and personal insignificance. A lot of people felt that they just didn't matter. They never saw themselves on the evening news. They didn't see their challenges. So you had this sort of combustible mix, which was apparent in the Tea Party movement in early as 2010, explosive in 2014, and just 2016 was in a way a continuation of that. And that plus the late intervention of James Comey and Vladimir Putin convincing people to vote for Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate, got Donald Trump for the White House. He actually improved his performance as an incumbent from 2016 to 2020, but the number of votes were sufficient to defeat him. And 2/3 of the people who left Hillary over Jim Comey's last-minute intervention in the election came back to Biden, and then he got more votes, and that offset the places where Trump had improvements. So he gets to be president. Now, politics is a performance art. I think we can restore confidence in the federal government if this bill that just passed is effectively implemented. A bunch of it's gone. It went out in direct checks, and it'll be well received, and it's popular with 70% of the people. Then the rest of it has to be implemented, and according to the news, Gene Sperling, who was the head of the National Economic Council, which I established in the White House, and which has been continued by all further future Democratic and Republican presidents, is going to do that, and I think he'll do a fine job. But democratic norms have been being stomped on for quite a while by people for fun and profit. And Trump just threw them all out the window, and most people found it exhilarating who were in his base because they didn't think that they existed anyway. So I think it's important to look at this. I am on balance quite optimistic about the future because of the young people listening to this Zoom tonight. We're younger on average than our competitors. We're more diverse. We have the university network, but it's hard to keep a democracy going. And when he was leaving office, or when he was fighting Joe McCarthy, finally, President Eisenhower has said something that has not received anything like the attention it needs. Everybody knows he warned us about the military-industrial complex, but he also talked about the extreme mental discipline that it took to preserve a democracy. And he said, I just don't know if we can keep doing it in the face of demagogues and emotional upheavals. And now we have the impact of the social media. So we're going to see what happens. But we're in a dogfight. And the Republicans actually think they won the last 2 weeks of the election. And they did. And they made hay out of the defund the police and the offhand socialism remark, and made it as if that was the credo of the Democratic Party. And they spooked enough people who should have, some of them should have known better, that they came back across the line, and you see where we are. It's a very close race. But I think that the Democrats right now, in my opinion, Biden has left the door open to working with Republicans, but he was very firm that we had to take a strong economic stand at first. I think he's handled himself pitch perfect. I think he's really doing well. But as a country, we face enormous challenges. And one of the things that all of you should be thinking about is, are you willing to do what it takes to revive our democracy? And what does that require? And how can you do it when basically you can't just entreat the Republican Party to abandon a strategy that they consider is essential to its survival and they believe they can make triumph. You can't blame Donald Trump for the fact that since the election, there have been over 200 bills introduced in state legislatures throughout America to restrict the right to vote, to make it harder for young people, college students, people of color, poor people, disabled people, you get it, to vote. Because I remember in one of these voting rights cases, a representative from the Texas Attorney General's office said in a federal court, yes, we are trying to make it harder for black and brown people to vote, but it's not because we're racist. It's because they don't vote for us. If they voted for us, we would make it easy for them to vote. And Lindsey Graham said something of the same kind, running against his African-American opponent in the last election in South Carolina. So we're divided, and we've always been divided, and we'll always have differences of opinion. But we need to find a way to get enough of each other together to work together. And George W. Bush and I spend a lot of time working on it now, because he's the last Republican who wasn't afraid of immigration.
Mm-hmm. Mr. President, you talked about students and young people. We have some questions that have been submitted by some Cornell students. I'd like to start with Kazuma Parkinson, who is a sophomore majoring in the College of Arts and Science. She's from Pittsburgh, and she asks, as the partisan divide grows larger, instead of ignoring those who disagree with us, do you have any advice on how to engage in political dialogue with friends or colleagues who have different views? It's a great transition because you just talked about your relationship with President Bush. So how do you deal with people whose views are simply starkly different from your own?
Well, I think, first of all, you have to get to know them. You have to confront them. You have to realize that we have become so political that we've essentially turned people who disagree with us into two-dimensional cartoons instead of three-dimensional people. And one of the reasons that I started the Clinton Global Initiative is I believe there's reams of hard evidence that diverse groups make better decisions than homogenous ones or lone geniuses. But in order to do it, you have to begin with the end in mind. And if there is an election between now and the end, it's very difficult to do that. Mm-hmm. So that's why you can see all of us, guys like Bush and me, we're out of office. We're not running for anything, so we can sound so reasonable. But I'm not so old and infirm that I can't remember what it was like to be on the line and have people trying to gut you every day and trying to avoid being gutted and prevail and get done what you wanted, what you believed in. But I think that what we are doing with the Presidential Leadership Scholars Program should have a model on every campus in America, in every community in America. We take 60 people every year, half Republicans, half Democrats, more or less. He picks 30, I pick 30. They're incredibly diverse, mostly between 29 and early 40s, mid-career people who have already shown that they care about the public interest by being involved in something beyond what they do for a living. And they go through this 6-month course. They visit his library and mine and his dad's library and the LBJ library. They look at a big decision a president made and how that decision was made and how it was affected, how Congress in a bipartisan way did or did not support it. And then they talk about how that can be applied locally. And unbelievable things have happened. I remember it typically, and then George W. Bush and I speak at their commencement every year. And typically after the service, the Republicans come up to me and thank me, and the Democrats come up to him and thank him because we gave them a chance to know people. I remember once we had 2 really tough Iraq and Afghan veterans, both of whom had lost a leg to an explosive device, one of whom still had a lot of shrapnel scars in his face. And they thanked me because they had had a chance to get to know the woman who ran the gay rights movement in Arkansas, who was a black woman who was almost as large as they were, big, strong, formidable person. And they said, we never met anybody like her before. She's got skills we don't have that we need to do what we're trying to do to help veterans. And we need more of this. So I think while you're in college, there ought to be something like that on every campus where people get a chance to actually listen to other people say what they believe, why they believe what they believe, and also to see how they define themselves, what is critical to their identities. Because we're basically in a country with a big identity crisis now. As you could see on January 6th, a lot of those people, you remember the guy that had his foot up on the Nancy Pelosi's desk?
Sure.
He was from Gentry, Arkansas.
Mm.
Now, I was governor there for 12 years. Gentry is a little town in northwest Arkansas in what historically has been a heavily Republican area since the Civil War. But at the end of the Civil War, that meant it was liberal. By the time, for the last 50 years, it's meant much more conservative, or 40 years anyway. So I was thinking about that guy and how proud he was, and how, to me, Gentry, Arkansas was embodied by a guy named Willie Dunaway, who was a local county committeeman in this little, there was only a couple hundred people there. And he was never out of overalls and boots, and he and his wife, Fleta, used to make pies for everybody, and they didn't care what your party was. And everybody loved him, including the people who never voted with him. Somehow we have to recover that.
Mr. President, Valentina Zhu, a third-year Cornell student from Shenzhen, China, asks, with the increased use of social media and technology, what role do they play in democracy? Do they expose people to more perspectives, or do they exacerbate polarization as they only feed what people want to see with an algorithm? Your thoughts on social media, sir?
Both.
Both.
That's the dilemma of the social media. The great thing is that, I've been out of office for 20 years, but I can have podcasts. And if anybody's interested, I did one with Bernice King today, Martin Luther King's daughter, who leads a big program. She's a lawyer and a minister and leads a program at the King Center using Dr. King's definition of love as the driving force in American politics. She's an amazing woman. So the good news is anybody who wants to tune in can do it. I think both Republicans and Democrats, unless they're people who believe that we should restrict the right to vote, would have liked what Bernice had to say. But it's also true that there's all kinds of stuff on the internet that's fact-free, and that all of us have a predisposition only to look at those things which confirm what we already believe. I'm always looking for something that will teach me something, that will give me new information or a different perspective. And I've always been that way. But a lot of us now are in such a bunker mentality that the social media reinforces that. And it's so bad that, some literally ridiculous things are widely believed.
Mm-hmm.
But this didn't start with the social media. It also started with the fact that in a lot of the mainstream political media, first, part of it became really conservative with the talk radio and Fox News and Breitbart. But also, as the survey that I was given by you folks about public opinion said, even the mainstream media was smitten by the influence they had when President Nixon was removed. And there became a trend, if you will, where politics was covered differently than other news. And you decided in advance what you wanted to achieve. And that's always a mistake if you're in journalism, because you got to watch where the facts take you. And if the story diverges from the storyline and you've already staked out the storyline, then the tendency to just not to outright lie, but just not to give any facts which, contradict the storyline is enormous. That's a very important principle in criminal justice. If I'm a prosecutor and you're a defense lawyer, and I really believe your client's guilty, and I have lots of evidence, if I come across evidence which calls that into question, I am legally bound to give it to you. And you then can make it public in a trial or in negotiations with me over a plea. There's nothing like that for the public. So, for example, I remember when in 2016, one of the things I would have gotten a kick out of it if it didn't hurt so bad, when, as Kevin McCarthy said, the Republicans organized the special Benghazi committee, not with people who knew a lot about classified information or State Department procedures or anything else. They were organized to take her numbers down because she had the highest approval rating of any public figure by a long ways. And the media knew that there had already been 6 congressional committees, all chaired by Republicans, who were on the level. These Republican chairmen, they did their jobs. The Republicans and Democrats asked questions. All 6 of them concluded that she had done nothing wrong and that she'd done a really good job of putting together this special committee to look at what caused Benghazi and how to avoid it in the future, and then implemented their 29 recommendations. Well, that was no good to them, but frankly, it didn't help the press either. Then it's very hard to keep a newspaper going today. You need clicks and retweets. If you're a national paper, you need your story to be on the evening news. If you're a big regional paper, on the local evening news. And so McCarthy actually said, he was refreshingly honest. He said, yeah, but look what that special committee did to her numbers. In other words, and they wouldn't have had that effect if every time, about once an hour, the press said, let me remind you, there have been 6 other committees.
Right, fact checked.
And so that just it happens.
Yeah.
And it always happens some, but it's a real problem today. So politics is about culture, conditions, candidates and their campaigns, and coverage. And so we have to examine all those things. We have to figure out, can we make our culture not necessarily less tribal, because we're all tribal. We're about to start March Madness. And I'm really tickled. Patrick Ewing, the coach of Georgetown, is an old friend of mine, and they got miraculously to the tournament. And both the Arkansas men and women are in the tournament. I'm a happy camper. So I'm tribal, but I'm an inclusive tribalist. Trump realized that exclusive tribalism was more powerful in 2016 and 2020 to keep people going. And we have to go back to being inclusively tribal if we want to make the most of the future. And we want to get rid of a lot of these inequalities.
Mr. President, I know you have to log off in just a few minutes, and so I want to ask this question. I want to close with you by going back to January 6th, which had to be one of the most pessimistic days in all your time in public service, and a time of great pessimism for all of us. What were your thoughts when that was happening? And more importantly, what would you tell Cornell students who are also watching that makes you more optimistic versus those horribly pessimistic images?
Well, let me start with the second question first. What should make you optimistic is that most Americans were mortified by it, including a lot of Americans who voted for Donald Trump. They didn't like it. They were horrified. Once the votes were actually cast and counted, even Republicans who had said, and all the way to the Supreme Court, who said, look, I'll help you keep people off the rolls. I'll help you make it harder for people to vote. But if they actually get to the ballot and they cast it, and there's not a shred of evidence that there's anything wrong with their vote. I am not about to pretend that they didn't vote and that their votes weren't what they obviously were. That should make you hopeful. There is a core from which we must build. And they were horrified by the violence and by the trashing of the Capitol. So you should be hopeful. What should bother you is how many people in this country believe there's no such thing as a norm, that a norm is just a fancy-dancy college word that the people who are in and win use. I remember the most troubling thing that happened to me when I was campaigning for Hillary in 2016 in the primary. So I couldn't tell if this young man was a supporter of Senator Sanders or a supporter of Donald Trump. But I went to the campus of East Carolina University. I was driving in North Carolina, and I stopped there. And I just got out and shook hands and took selfies and answered questions. And most of the people who came up to support Hillary were women students. But there was this muscular, blonde-haired, blue-eyed man there kind of wandering around the back. And he comes up to me and he said, "Tell me, how did it feel to take $50 million out of your foundation?" And I could tell he believed it. And I guess it was on some website somewhere. And I laughed and I said, "Look, I know you read that somewhere," but I said, "That's way more than I'm worth." And I didn't do it. I've never taken a penny out, and I've given more than $20 million, Hillary and I have, to our foundation, in addition to the other things we supported. And I said, and you don't have to take my word for it. I said, unlike Mr. Trump and Senator Sanders, I said, we have published 38 years of our tax returns, and you can see exactly every year how much I made and what we gave to charity. So don't take my word for it. Just look at it. It's online. It's all posted. And he looked at me and he says, "Yeah, you can do that when you control the establishment." In other words, it was like I was hitting a brick wall. He knew what he wanted to believe, and by God, he was going to hold on to it regardless. And he was in a college there. So that's why I think he'd be more likely to be honest and open up if one of his classmates got a smaller group of them together, of people who were on both sides of whatever they were arguing about, and just started to talk. Said, what do we want America to look like? How do we get from here to there? And, you know, my experience in life is that most people are pretty good folks. And I've yet to meet one that was perfect. But when we deal with people at a distance, and keep in mind, the reason the social media is so potentially dangerous is it's so fast and there's so much there. And it doesn't do nuance very well. How many times have you and I talked about the challenges that you had selling various programs or positions you took to the people in your district? They kept reelecting you partly because they knew you and they came to trust you, and they would have a conversation with you. So I really believe that this Cornell program can be most valuable, perhaps not just in bringing in people like me to talk, but having the students talk to each other. Identity is a powerful thing. And how people see themselves matter a lot. And when you're mad at somebody, let me tell you one thing. I had an 8th grade science teacher. Now, I will be 75 years old this year. So I was 13 in the 8th grade. It was 62 years ago. We get to the end of the semester. It was June. And Vernon Dokie looked at us, and to be charitable, he was not a handsome man. He was a retired coach. He gained weight. He was still in his old clothes. He had the Coke bottle glasses, and he smoked cheap cigars out of a plastic cigar holder that made his face look like a beak that was hawked up. He said, "You're not going to remember anything in 8th grade science when you grow up. If you don't remember anything, remember this." He said, "Every day I get up and I go into the bathroom and I throw water in my face, and then I shave and I wash it off and I dry my face, and I look in that mirror and I say, 'Vernon, you're beautiful.'" He said, everybody wants to believe they're beautiful. He said, if you just remember that one thing, it'll take you a long way. We spend too much time making people feel like they're ugly. And we need to get back to an inclusive empowerment orientation. Do I think economics is part of it? I do. Is culture part of it? Yes. Is naked politics part of it? Yes. But we need things that we can't get from the social media today. And a lot of it's going to depend on our building networks. Robert Putnam, the great sociologist, says that the most successful societies are ones where a diverse group of people all accept rules, yes, but have networks, and that builds trust. He said, if you don't have the networks and the trust, you can have all the rules in the world. If the rules get broken, the networks and trust will keep you going.
Mr. President, we want to respect your schedule. We know that you...
I put something off a half an hour because I was so excited about this.
Oh, you're so kind, but we know how busy you are. I want to conclude by, again, thanking you for inspiring us, for giving us hope, but also a pretty candid view of the work ahead of us. And so, Mr. President, thank you again. Ladies and gentlemen, President Bill Clinton. Before, as the President logs off, I want to remind you that we have an expert faculty panel that's going to respond to President Clinton's words. Mr. President, again, thank you very much. And while you're logging off, sir, I am going to introduce our response panel. We have Professor Suzanne Mettler, the John L. Senior Professor of American Institutions at Cornell University and co-author of 4 Threats, The Recurring Crises of American Democracy. Fabulous book you must read. Professor Rachel Riedel, the John S. Knight Professor of International Studies and the Director of the Mario Einaudi Center for International Studies. And finally, Professor Doug Kreiner, the Clinton Rossiter Professor in American Institutions and Faculty Director of the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs. Suzanne Mettler, Professor Mettler, let's begin with you. You've written this extraordinary book, 4 Threats, The Recurring Crises of American Democracy. What struck you about President Clinton's words?
Well, first of all, it's lovely to be here and a great honor to be here with President Clinton. And I really appreciated your comments about how it's hard to keep a democracy going and that it takes tremendous discipline and that we're in a dogfight. I couldn't agree more. And so, a few years ago, frankly, as a scholar of American politics, I was really puzzled because while many of us had done a lot of thinking for years about how could democracy be more inclusive and stronger, et cetera, I had not been fundamentally worried about the state of democracy. And then I started to think that maybe I should be. And so my co-author and I, Robert Lieberman, we started to learn from colleagues who study democratic deterioration around the world and what are the determinants of it that make countries elsewhere endangered. And we learned from them that there are basically 4 threats that can be dangerous. Any one of them alone can be dangerous. So one is political polarization, when society and politics comes to feel like a game of us versus them, when instead of thinking of fellow citizens as just, fellow citizens who might have different views than you, you start to think of them as political enemies. The second is conflict over who belongs. So for democracy to work well, we need to have pretty broad agreement on who's included as a member of society and what their status is. But, in the United States, we had a cleavage at the time of our founding over race, and it's been a problem for us again and again. So that conflict over who belongs, and it can also, of course, be over the status of immigrants. The third is when you have high and rising economic inequality, which we've had in the United States now since the 1970s, although it lessened quite a bit during the 1990s, I might add, when President Clinton was in office. And then the fourth is executive aggrandizement, when you have increased power in the executive branch relative to the legislature. So any one of these things can cause problems. And what we did was we looked through American history, and we found that, in fact, American democracy has been fragile time and again in many different earlier periods of time. In the 1790s, political polarization alone was actually really dangerous for the country. In the 1850s, in the lead up to the Civil War, you had those first three threats combined, and it led to this bloody Civil War. The first three threats combined again in the 1890s, and it led to the disenfranchisement of millions of African-American men, and that lasted for 60 years. So it was at the subnational level, but it was actually approved by leaders at the national level. And then, in the 20th century, things were more calm. We had executive aggrandizement acting alone. In the 1930s, a lot of people were worried that democracy was going to deteriorate, but it did not do so fundamentally. Watergate was another crisis of democracy, but it was contained. Afterwards, Democrats and Republicans came together and really tried to strengthen democracy. But here we are in this period of time, for the first time in American history, all four of these threats have converged, and they're all at a very high level. So it's really very dangerous. And so we really need to take it very seriously, I think, what President Clinton said about how we all need to do our part to strengthen democracy. So I'll stop there, turn it over to my colleagues.
Rachel Riedel.
Thanks for having me. And also, it's a great pleasure and honor to be here with you, President Clinton. I want to echo Suzanne in one way, and in particular to say one remark that really struck me is, as President Clinton said, we have to ask ourselves whether we're willing to do what it takes. And I would add, as educators, as members of our country's general public, we have to know what that is. What should we be doing? And I think that's at the heart of this idea of a campaign for the future of democracy. As we've been discussing tonight, democracy is always something that has to be claimed. It's a set of norms and institutions, but the content of which has to be continually defined. And in fact, it's continually challenged by constituents and by leaders. And leaders have to be pushed by their constituents to show that upholding democratic practice is always a first order priority. And that's certainly not the case right now in terms of the way in which, as we've just been discussing, the Republican Party doesn't necessarily see its best case strategy as one of expanding voting rights or expanding inclusive citizenship. So that is a real challenge, I think, to the nature of upholding democracy and democratic content in this moment. The United States has always had waves of historical pushes for broadening and deepening inclusion and representation to make democracy work better for the benefit of its citizens, but it's also had periods of reactionary challenges to inclusive citizenship. So I think that the myth of American exceptionalism may push us to articulate certain sets of ideals, but it also has a dangerous underside, because the idea that democracy is certain is also one that maybe undermines the reality that there are huge elements of inequality, right? We are one of the most unequal democracies. We're one of the most unrepresentative democracies. We're a democracy in which our institutions have been built to allow and even foster pockets of subnational authoritarianism, in which large percentages of our citizens do not enjoy equal access to basic fundamental rights. Voting rights, the rights to due process, the rights to protection and security provided by state agents such as the police. And these protections are essential to us all as the foundations of liberty. So what to do for the future of democracy? I think that it is essential that none of us turn away from reforming institutions. Don't disengage. Don't think it's futile. Don't turn away from working within the system. So claiming democracy is working for our nation and your vision of what you want it to be, working to expand voting rights, to get people registered to vote. There's nothing more bipartisan and democratic than that. Work to use your voice to reach out to your elected members of Congress, certainly, but also pay attention to local school boards and village councils. These are the places which determine access to housing, education, social services. Pay attention to the appointment of state officials who, as we've just seen in the last election, have a large role in carrying out free and fair elections. So engage within and across communities to claim democracy for all of our futures. Thank you.
And before we go to Professor Kreiner, Mr. President, I just want you to know I just received a text from an old friend of yours and colleague of mine, former Congressman Mike Ross from Arkansas. Says hello. He's a good man. Professor Kreiner.
Well, thank you. I'd like to just add my thanks to President Clinton. When we often talk about sort of political identity to students, we talk about your first formative political experience. And I can very much remember mine. It was volunteering for a campaign, Clinton Gore 92, knocking on doors in upstate South Carolina. So it was actually really a great opportunity for practicing your skills of talking with people that might disagree with you. So a little relevant for what we were talking about today. I'd also like to pick up on something that Professor Riedel just talked about, which is institutions and reforming our institutions. And we focused a lot today on voting rights, which is incredibly important. But I think that the fate of H.R. 1 right now in Congress illustrates another institutional challenge too. And sort of what is the role of institutions? So President Clinton talked about one of the main goals of the founders, right, to prevent the abuse of power. And they did it in a number of different ways, with separation of powers and then mixing of powers, with checks and balances and the rest. Richard Hofstadter, the great historian, called our constitutional system a glorious system of mutual frustration. And that may have worked pretty well in the 19th century. But I think for a lot of Americans, it's a big source of their frustration today. There's a perception, we could debate to what extent it's fair, that government is unable to deal with a lot of the most pressing challenges facing our country today. And so some of what we need to do is to focus, I think, on restoring democratic norms and trust. But one other way of doing that is by showing through doing that government is still effective and rebuilding that trust in this way. Obviously, it's an important part of what the president is hoping to do with the COVID relief bill recently signed into law. But Congress struggles to legislate. Yes, polarization and our 50-50 rough divide in our country exacerbates the problem. But Congress's own rules and institutions are also to blame. The filibuster most directly and the center of our conversation, national conversation today with H.R. 1, but there are other institutions as well. Are there changes that we can make to strengthen the ability of Congress to once again be the people's branch, Article 1, as Robert Byrd would say, and to be more of a leader, I think, in terms of our national discourse? And I think this is a really overcoming that would go a long way to combating some of the erosion of trust, this perception that government can't work. The flip side of legislative gridlock is that so much policymaking today happens exclusively in the executive branch, through executive orders, memoranda, directives, and the like, as well as through the administrative state and the bureaucracy and regulations. This can help achieve meaningful change in areas where legislation is gridlocked, but it's also problematic. There are limits to what can be done unilaterally and administratively, and increasingly these actions are being litigated in courts in exceedingly gruesome detail in ways that take such a very long time. There's also a big democratic deficit with so much change being made executively without the input of the people's representatives in Congress, and there are big problems of accountability. And then we have, sort of on the flip side, restoring our checks and balances that we saw eroded through the systematic refusal to honor congressional subpoenas, to provide documentation, to work with Congress in meaningful ways. And so I'd like us to also focus a little bit on what types of institutional reforms might help us restore a sense that government is working and it's able to address the challenges today, but also that the checks and balances of our governing system are still robust and functioning.
Mr. President, you have been extraordinarily gracious and generous. You were supposed to leave us about 20 minutes ago. You're still with us. Do you any response to what the professors have said? Any closing thoughts from you?
Well, first of all, I think what all three of you said was very helpful, and I thank you, Suzanne, for saying what you did. We did do everything we could, even with the Republican Congress, to reduce income inequality. And if you look at a block of the best performing, basically trickled down 8 years was Reagan's 8 years. And if you compare that with the 8 years where I served, you can say, oh, Clinton just got a lot of breaks. He got the first of the dot-com revolution and spread into every part of our economy. But the bottom 20% income increased 23.6%, as opposed to less than 1% under Reagan. The next 20% was about 18%, as opposed to 9%. The next was about 12 to 16, as I remember. And the 80% was about the same. That is, essentially 95% of the people did better under what we did. And as a result, income inequality decreased. And it's the only time in the last 60 years when the bottom 20%'s income in percentage terms rose more than the top 20%, except at the very end of George W. Bush's term, when the stock market collapsed, and then that's one way to promote inequality, is to make rich people poor, but it never lasts, and it shouldn't. No, we shouldn't want that. We should want the bottom to rise and the middle class to rise. So that is a real problem. And even though we had all these plans to try to do the same thing with wealth accumulation, but I ran out of time and didn't have the votes for a lot of them. But if the reason I mention it is twofold. One is, at the end of my term, support for and trust in the federal government was at a 30-year high. And it turns out to be a total aberration. But if you deliver, if people think you're out there helping everybody, it changes attitudes. I mean, it's inconceivable to think about now, but, we carried West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, Arkansas, and Louisiana twice, and Florida and Georgia once. So it was a different world. And Arizona, we carried Arizona the second time. But it was because people thought we were rising together. Now, when President Obama tried to do the same thing as soon as he dealt with the emergency. So it's not fair to judge him against either Reagan's numbers or mine, because he had first to stop a hurtling toward calamity. After that, he had more equal distribution of income growth than under any of the members of the trickle-down society. And the second point I want to make is, the one thing we did, I've been holding a series of video conferences with my foundation on an inclusive economic recovery. And we just observed the 25th anniversary of the Community Development Financial Institutions Law that I passed. And it's very interesting to see that that's the one thing we did, along with the New Markets Tax Initiative, that had overwhelming Republican as well as Democratic support. And they still supported it. When under Trump's presidency, they put another, I think, $12 billion into community development financial institutions. Now, you may think that's a little thing, but when we enforced the Community Reinvestment Act, which has been on the books since the 70s, because I had a really vigorous controller of the currency and a vigorous SEC, that accounted for $800 billion in 1990s money. That's a lot of money flowing into underserved areas, Black, brown, and white, and other immigrant, first-generation immigrant, low-income communities. And as a result, when it was over, the highest income gains were made by African Americans, the second highest by Latinos. But the overall income gains were so robust that there was no racial resentment. Now, I want to be perfectly fair. The changing demographics which superficially make it better for the Democrats, also made it more frightening for non-college educated white people whose resentment was whipped up in places like small town and rural Wisconsin, which was stubbornly enduring in this election. So I do think that the points you all made are right. One, you can't quit. Second, there are certain institutional things that have to be shored up. And third, all four of these conditions existing, which have caused the degradation of democracy, is frightening. But the one way back, I think, to at least reduce it from 4 to 3 is to go at this economic inequality through an aspirational framework that make it difficult for Republicans not to support it as they have in the past. And we know it will make a difference. We know because we did it for 8 years, and because in President Obama's second term, when we finally started having job growth again, and they reintroduced these reforms, sometimes in more vigorous form and better form, they made a difference. So we know how to do this. And unlike a president issuing an executive order like ones I love, to reverse what Trump did to what President Obama and I did to protect lands, for example, in the West, in Grand Staircase Escalante and Bears Claws in Utah, for example. If you do it on economic things, the federal government has enough levers out there to increase growth in a targeted fashion by somewhere between 0.5% and 1% every year. But if focused on small town and rural areas and on distressed urban areas, it can make a huge difference. Tom Vilsack, I was thrilled when President Biden named him to go back to agriculture, because he was the unsung hero in the Obama years, and I could never figure out, he's so modest, he could never figure out how to claim credit, or he could have saved us from an earthquake and no one would have known it because he was so modest. But Vilsack got permission from Republicans to collapse a bunch of federal programs that were named for members of Congress but didn't have enough money in them to make a difference, combine the money, and the Agriculture Department's investment created 250,000 jobs in very rural areas of America that would not exist but for him. And most people never knew it and didn't give either him or President Obama the credit they deserve for proving this concept that we could, the federal government, quite apart from the levels of money they spend, which is critical in this, and they did absolutely the right thing to go big, but in any time they can accelerate growth in targeted areas, and it would make a huge difference in making it possible for neighbors to talk to each other again instead of screaming at each other. And the other thing you said is absolutely right. You know, we just got to get out of this looking at each other as enemies. You said that Congressman Ross, who just texted Steve Israel, they were big buddies. Mike Ross ran for governor. The chosen candidate of the leader of our party, then the governor of Arkansas, Mike Beebe, the last Democratic governor we had, he had a 70% approval rating. And Mike Ross had a 70% approval rating in his congressional district for the job he did as congressman. Mm-hmm. And he lost the governor's race by 8 points, and he lost his own district because his name, there was a D behind his name, because we had gone so far off the deep end. So they said to Mike Beebe, thank you very much. We love you. You got a lot of us health care, and we just don't believe you. Goodbye. In the same election, James Lee Witt, who was my FEMA director and was by far the most popular member of my cabinet, I think, just because he was so good at what he did, ran for Congress in Mike Ross's district, which by then had become 44% Republican, 33% independent, 33 for whatever the rest, 33% Democrat and the rest independent. But the truth, the independents just didn't want to say they were Republicans yet. James Lee Witt had a higher name recognition than his opponent, a higher positive rating than his opponent, a lower negative rating than his opponent, and he lost the race by 11 points. He lost his race by the party registration. So that is what is happening. That is what we have to crawl out of. And to go back to Suzanne's 4 conditions, there needs to be something done on all 4 of those. And on the cultural stuff, Biden can do the best by just remaining an open door and delivering the goods. He has to perform. The human outreach has to be done, I think, by others. And meanwhile, we can't give up trying to make the institutional framework of America work. So I would, if it were me, even if I had to abolish the filibuster for that rule, I would pass the Federal Voting Rights Act because I think that's essential for the operation of democracy. Anyway, I've talked more than I'm into, but you get the feel for it. It's a very formidable challenge out there. And I see it all through, because I go home a lot. My library's there, and none of this has surprised me, all the stuff that happened in the last few years. And I remember having an argument with Mike Beebe when he said, you better hope that Trump's nominated because these other people seem acceptable. And I said, I disagree with you. I think he'd be the hardest to beat because he is unleashing the animal spirits, you know? So anyway, we can do this, but it's a job, and it's a gold mine of opportunity for all of you in the academic world to plumb the depths of all this and try to analyze it and explain it to people in a way they can understand, and then empower students with a way forward.
And that is exactly what the Campaign for Democracy intends to do, Mr. President, the project of the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell. President Clinton, your staff told us you had to get off half an hour ago. We are eternally grateful to you for sticking with us. Doug Kreiner, Suzanne Mettler, Rachel Riedel, thank you for participating in the panel. For your information about the Campaign for the Future of Democracy, just go to our website, iopga.cornell.edu/CFD, or you can just Google the Cornell Institute of Politics. When you get to our homepage, there's a link for the Campaign for the Future of Democracy. If you want to support our efforts to strengthen resilience against attempts to undermine democratic norms, foreign or domestic, please join us at the Campaign for the Future of Democracy. This is the first of a series of conversations supported by Howard Milstein and the Milstein Democracy Forum. We look forward to seeing you at future events. Thank you again to everybody. Stay healthy. Bye-bye, everybody.
After all that's happened,
The deadly siege on Congress as an angry pro-Trump mob storms the U.S. Capitol.
This is one of those pivotal moments when every one of us, as citizens of the United States, need to determine just who it is that we are, just what it is that we stand for.
The daily work of democracy itself is the path of progress. It teaches cooperation, the free exchange of ideas, peaceful resolution of differences.
There is nothing wrong with America that cannot be cured by what is right with America.
This is precisely our mission today, to preserve freedom as well as peace. We must take actions to assist the campaign for democracy.
together we can protect democracy in America. Join the campaign for the future of democracy. Go to the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell University to learn more.